All right, guys, good evening. We'll get started with our Chapter 5 and 6 review session in just a moment. Hopefully you guys have all had a good weekend. And so we'll give people a chance to dip in really quickly. Remember, tomorrow's test, Chapters 5 through 6, we'll be working on that throughout the entire class period, and then we'll be starting at Chapter 7, starting tomorrow night and working our way into that this week. But we'll have more updates about that then. So hopefully I've stalled long enough to allow people to start dipping in. So we'll get started with our review session. I've got a posting that says you can't hear me. Is that still the case? Awesome. So it looks like the volume thing has been taken care of. If it's still a problem, please feel free to let me go. But here we go. We'll get started with the review session, and I'll start checking back through the list to see if there's any sort of additional questions or any problems like that. Chapters 5 and 6, I had somebody asking the question initially, just what are the big takeaways, like we talked about them in class with the chapters. So let me start off with that to kind of give you just a big overview of what you should be noticing as you're starting with the review process for tomorrow's test. Chapter 5, Colonial Society on the Eve of Revolution. So remember, this is the chapter that's focused on the 1700s and how America is becoming more developed and more diverse. As there's more immigrants and more challenges to the authority, the Great Awakening is happening during that time period. And so with that diversity, you've got more people flooding into the area who don't necessarily meet the same characteristics of what the previous groups had. For Chapter 6, that's our foreign policy chapter. And so what they're trying to show you is a turning point where when they start talking about the duel for North America, the two elements that we want to be able to do is we want to be able to talk about, first of all, the French and how they have a colonial style that has similarities and differences to what the British and the Spanish are doing. And then we also want to be able to talk about the French and Indian War, which removes the French as a barrier out west, and it also takes away the middle ground where the Native Americans have been playing the British and the French against each other for the better part of a century. That's now gone. And so for the colonists who are left behind, the British are going to be very interested in the new territories in the Ohio River Valley, but the British government is not going to want to let the British colonists move out there, and that's the Proclamation Line of 1763. That's going to lead to tensions, and so this is the end of our colonial period of salutary neglect. And after this, in the next week, we'll be talking about the path to the revolution, where the colonists are going to decide that they just can't stay with the British anymore because of all the new rules that are happening with the monarchy back in place again. So, as we get started today, let me see here. Looks like we're still good, and so here we begin. Question number 1 says, what importance did King Louis XVI have in regards to Voyager's success in America, or did they just name things after him to honor him? I think the question is asking about Louis XIV, and so I think the I and the V in that question are flipped around because he's the earlier one. Louis XIV is very much mercantilistic like other Europeans during this time period, where he wants to get wealth out of the New World. But he's also got a problem where, because of some of his decisions, like his edict, which is going to give some versions of religious toleration, and the economic situations going on in Europe, a lot of French people aren't going to colonize like they did in the British colonies, and that's going to hamstring the French. So they do name a lot of things after him, but it's also going to be something that is very much about him trying to drive people to the New World to build up colonies. The next question says, well, who were the merchant princes and what were their significance? The merchant princes that they're referring to in your chapters, they mentioned that during the period of Chapter 5, remember Chapter 5 and Chapter 6 overlap. And so in Chapter 5, when they talk about New Englanders who are getting rich off of the war because they're selling supplies to the people who need them during the wars themselves, these people become known as merchant princes. although I think it's more of a textbook term than it is for like actually how they'd refer to each other back then, where they're describing people who are getting rich and powerful and influential because they're making money off of all the wars that are happening on the frontier. In the 1700s, was the gap between rich and poor increasing, decreasing, and why? I think it's much more complicated than that question lays itself out to be. You can find that there are some places where there's definitely a gigantic gap, like in the Chesapeake, where it keeps widening. And I think you'll also find that there's an established rich group, especially in the middle and upper New England colonies, that are becoming very, very rich. But I also think that a lot of people are coming to America during this time period, and they're improving their standard of living above what they had back in Europe. So it's a more complicated question based on, are you evaluating where they end up, or are you evaluating from beginning to where they end their economic growth? And so I don't know that you would need to spend a lot of time focusing on that in particular, although you should recognize that everywhere they're having a more rigid class system in the 1700s than the relatively loose system they had in the 1600s when they were trying to sort out what their colonies were about. Next question. What were the most important professions in the 1700s? It's tricky to answer that question because there's kind of an element of where we are nowadays with professionalism. 90+% of the people who were in the United States at this time were farmers. And they felt that they were good people because they were close to God and they were farming and they were doing what they were supposed to be doing. And so if you ask them what are the best professions, there's a solid chance that they would tell you that they were doing what they were supposed to be doing, and that was proper. Ministers have a high amount of regard, and then eventually professionals will start growing in reputation in the 1700s, but even more so when you get to the 1800s, where you'll have scholars and other sorts of people who are becoming big in the United States. Most of the people, though, are during this time period, farming is their route. Let me see here. Did the jailbirds choose to come to the colonies? Remember, those are individuals who in Britain were being put into poorhouses, and they were given a choice of either going into the poorhouse or getting onto a boat and going to America as a settler over here. And so they were given the opportunity to choose between the two of them, although there would be times that they would empty criminals onto boats and ship them off either to these colonies or else Australia will eventually become a penal colony later, and that's what they've got a huge reputation for. What was the Molasses Act? The Molasses Act is going to be a law that you read about inside your textbook, which is one of the earliest navigation acts. And so you remember that there are periods of salutary neglect where the king is leaving the colonists alone. This is one of those periods where they're moving away from salutary neglect, where they're trying to put rules onto the colonists as far as where they could or could not trade stuff. And so what they'd like to do is, with the triangle trade that's going on, molasses is coming from the Indies, and they're moving up to America, and then that molasses is being turned into rum, and it's either being sent to Africa or else to Europe. And the British would like to figure out ways to route that through their territories so they're able to capitalize off of that and make money. This is mercantilism. They also want to freeze out other groups like the French and the Dutch so that the British colonists aren't trading with them. The British colonists, though, don't like being told who they get to trade with, and so there's all sorts of ways that they're trying to get around things so that they can trade with whoever they want to. So there's a lot of smuggling and bribery going on of government officials here in America because they want to figure out ways to get around that. Let me see here. What does this mean? Church of England was less fierce and more worldly than the religion of puritanical New England. I'm going to have to take a guess. The thing that we think about with the Anglican Church is they are very much more moderate with their viewpoints, where they aren't literally reading the Bible and believing that there's like demons and witches and those sorts of individuals that are creeping around in the backcountry. The Puritans take a much more fundamentalist view on religion, which is very much less tolerant of different viewpoints and very much more concerned about God's salvation and also what He can do to people in the real world. And so that's going to be the difference that they have. So the witch trials that you see in Salem are very much representing the fact that the church up in New England was very much more strict. than what you saw going on in England itself. What's the difference between the Congregational and the Presbyterian minister, and why do they fight with political questions? I think there's a bigger religious questions going on there that isn't going to be essential for your AP US history class. With religions, they're really wanting you to understand that there are different religious groups that are present here inside the United States, and that diversity is leading them to not be as united as you would think they would be, since most of us, when we learn about the American Revolution, learn about the colonies coming together and joining with one another. And so for us, this is very much a chapter that's focused on there are differences that are hard to bridge. So Congregationalists, that's a big term, kind of like Protestant, that has a bunch of groups underneath it. So a Congregationalist is just a type of religion that instead of having a pope or a bishop or that sort of leadership, each congregation or church group gets to make their own decisions for their own township about what religiously they should and should not be doing. As far as why the Presbyterians are having issues, Presbyterians are from the English territories, but they are also Calvinists, and so I'm not really certain what you're driving towards with your question. But the two of them, like if you're talking about the Puritans versus the Presbyterians, they wouldn't have liked each other, but it would have been more of like an ethnic sort of thing going on, and a difference in how they're interpreting the religion rather than anything else. What were the effects after the Awakening? So with the First Great Awakening, the big thing that you want to dial into is the fact that you've got a debate going on in the Puritan Church between the Old Lights, who believe in the old-style puritanical religion, and the New Lights, who believe that there's a way for you to work your way into God's good graces and go to heaven. And the two of them are going to battle with each other during the First Great Awakening, and that's going to lead to the creation of two new churches in New England. So the Puritan Church will split into like Methodists and Baptists and other sorts of groups that we recognize nowadays that divide with one another again, after they had already divided between like Puritans and Pilgrims, and then also the Puritans versus the Catholics or the Anglicans over in England. And so it's another division for them. It's showing that there isn't the unity in the 1700s that we would assume was there if you just kind of basically learn about the 13 colonies. The next question I see here is, what was the Albany Congress and what did it do? The Albany Congress was Ben Franklin's idea, where he wanted to create a central government here in the New World, and that central government that was going to be here would be like a confederacy to try to defend the colonists against the Native Americans, so that there would be a unified defense, and they could also do some planning with one another to govern themselves. Remember, with the Albany Congress, though, the king didn't want to allow this because he didn't want to give the colonists the power to govern themselves. And on the other hand, the colonists didn't want this because they didn't want to lose what they had already gotten with salutary neglect. And so the two of them disagreed with the Albany Plan on very different reasons that were running counter to each other. What did the Regulator Movement do? The Regulator Movement was something that was happening in North Carolina, and it was people in the backcountry who were fighting with the people on the coastline, who were the elites, over the way that the Native Americans should be treated in the western part of the state. And so the Regulators are very much similar to like Bacon's Rebellion. They're very much descended from the Scotch-Irish, and they're very much feeling like the British colonists on the coastline look down on them and do not want to give them any respect or power or anything, rather than just keep them in the backcountry as second-class citizens. And so it's an uprising against that viewpoint. Who was William Pitt, and why was Louisbourg so important? Remember, William Pitt is the Prime Minister of England, who during the French and Indian War is going to put his focus on the Americas for that war, unlike the previous wars that you had seen, where like Queen Anne's War, where you had a focus not so much on the Americas, but instead on Europe. William Pitt decides to make the French and Indian War the last war against the French by rooting them out and getting them rid as colonies. And so as far as Louisbourg, remember, that is going to be that fortress that is at the mouth of the St. Lawrence River, where if you control that, you've got a pretty decent shot at being able to then cut off paths down the St. Lawrence, which is one of the main ways that the French were getting supplies for themselves in the French colonies. And so this becomes a very important thing. And we learned about during one of the wars, during King George's War, we're going to have a battle where New Englanders will take over this fort, and then immediately afterwards the king will give it back during the treaty negotiations, which leads to a lot of hostility from the colonists who believe that they're not being respected or treated fairly in the negotiations they're having. Why was the Battle of Quebec so important? It's because that's the capital city of Canada, and when that falls, essentially the rest of the resistance is going to have struggles to try to hold back the British if the biggest, most important city of Canada also falls during the French and Indian War. Who were the Protestant Huguenots? These are French Calvinists who are not welcome in France, but they are going to find themselves treated a little better when the Edict of Nantes is going to come into place. And that's going to provide some religious toleration, but they're still going to be on the outs in a lot of cases. Many of the Huguenots will come to the Americas, but they'll settle in kind of scattered squatter settlements away from like the French colonies because they are outsiders. Who were the Jesuits? Jesuits are Catholic priests coming from France who are going through the backcountry trying to convert Native Americans. It says also, what was the Jesuits trying to do to the Indians during the Catholic missionaries? I think what you're trying to get to is what was their goal. And the Jesuits were going through the backcountry trying to convince Native Americans to become Catholic, and many of them were executed by the Native Americans who were not interested in going that direction. We just talked about the Edict of Nantes just a second ago. When it says the college is focused on doctrine and dogma, what does that mean? A lot of the new questions are now. A lot of the new colleges are going to be focused on like rote memorization, religion, very much classical teaching. So it's not going to be like open-ended sort of stuff. It's not going to, where you're going to like doing like question and answer sort of things. It's not going to be like an art major or a social studies major or a professional major. A lot of them are going to be focused on like becoming a minister or becoming a lawyer, and the memorization that goes along with that. And so their education is going to be much less open-minded than a lot of the education that you guys will be running into when you go to college. Could I expand on the Zenger trial and its significance? Essentially, the Zenger trial, like we mentioned in class, is going to be the trial where you had a person put on trial in America for his newspaper writing bad stuff about British officers, and the things he was writing could have been labeled as liable in British law, so he should have been guilty. But remember, he was found not guilty by the juries because of the fact that he was telling the truth about this. And so we're going to find that a lot of American juries are now showing they're not following official British law. They're going to be going their own direction with the interpretation of how the British laws should be interpreted. And this is very much a foundation for our First Amendment, freedom of speech and freedom of the press, where the colonists really prize this as something that's important for their colony to have. Why did the French and the British fight over the Ohio River Valley? That's some of the best farmland in the entire world, and both of them were moving closer to it. The French from the Great Lakes and the Mississippi River, the 13 colonists from the East Coast. The two are pinching into the middle of that area, and remember, the Native Americans are occupying what we were calling the middle ground in between those two powers, and so those areas are pretty well filled, and everybody's kind of looking at that as a great place to have, especially since we focused on the idea of how important rivers are when it comes to economic development in the 1700s. Why is Detroit important? Detroit is one of the major trading posts that are established by the French, and so it becomes a very important city for the British to capture during the French and Indian War. Who are the French Acadians? These are people who immigrated out of France. They settled in Acadia just north of Maine, and they will become involved in the French and Indian War and other conflicts where they'll be battling with the English colonists, and then they'll be eventually moved out by the British. They will eventually get sent to New Orleans. They'll become Arcadians. Other than the fact that George Washington started the French and Indian War, what other significance did the war have? I'm not following that question. So if it's about George Washington will stay involved in the war throughout the entire war as a leader of American militia troops joined with the British. And while he'll fight valiantly, a lot of the British will not look very respectfully on what he's done. When it comes to the French and Indian War, the importance of that war is going to be the idea that this is going to be the last war to fight with the French, because the French will be displaced and moved out of the way to allow the British to be able to take over their entire empire. What was the Seven Sea War? They're pointing out to you that they want you to understand that there are multiple seas or oceans that this war, the French and Indian wars are going. Sorry, the French and English wars will get into, because essentially they're world wars between the English and the French, and also the other Europeans that are rolled up in this, and all of their colonies. So you have far-flung wars that are far away from the countries of origin, who are still fighting because they're allied with one side or the other. Are we going to need to know all the artists in Chapter 5? We discussed in class that you do not. You're looking for trends. So big trends or movements, and if you find an artist that is still incredibly well known nowadays, that person might work their way into the test, but typically that's not going to be a major component of our test. We're looking more politically, socially, economically, culturally, rather than artistically. And so we'll highlight for you the specific artists we want to notice. Like the artists that they mentioned inside your textbook, they talk about Crevecoeur, who is an author during this time period, and that's the next question. He was a Frenchman who came over and wrote about what Americans were like, and then dispensed that throughout all of Europe, so they had an idea of what Americans' thoughts were. As far as artists go, they're largely doing portraiture, so and a lot of it is being influenced by what's happening over in Europe. So there aren't a lot of distinctive American art form styles that are popular during this time period. It's typically influenced by the British, and so I wouldn't be too worried about the artistic piece and what impact that's having. Let me see here. The next question. What impact did the Germans have in the colonies? Remember, they landed here in the New World, and then they settled deep in the backcountry of places like Pennsylvania, and they became farmers. They set up their own colonies with their own cultural things. They try to hold on to their German ancestry and culture, and so they're going to be the next wave of immigrants coming in who start filling into the backcountry and putting pressure on the Native Americans, butting into French territory, and it'll help precipitate some of the conflicts that we're going to be having with the French. In which periods of time did salutary neglect not occur? You're going to be the one who determines that when you see the British coming in to put more of a heavy influence on the colonists than just leaving them alone. So you see that with like the Dominion of New England that you read about in Chapter 4, or you see that with the Molasses Act in Chapter 5. And so whenever the king steps in and decides that the colonists need to have somebody else's influence outside of them, that's going to be ending a bit of salutary neglect. Most notably in 1763 with your proclamation line of 1763, and also the increase in taxes. That's typically seen as the official end of salutary neglect and the movement towards a revolution, because the colonists are missing what they had. How diverse were the different parts of the colonies? Very diverse economically, very diverse religiously, ethnically, climatologically they are. So, I mean, you've got a lot of things that are making them different from one another. And you've already seen that they were pretty much divided into a north and south over plantation slavery. And we're about to see that as we move towards the American Revolution, the north will become more urban, even though they have a lot of farms. And the south will stay pretty rural. And this is going to be a divide that we see going all the way up to the Civil War. What happened during the Paxton Boys movement and the Regulator movement? Like we mentioned just a little bit ago, that's going to be the battle between the people in the back country and the people on the coastline, where you've got the people in the back country wanting the colony to get together and root out Native American resistance so that there's open spaces on the frontier to move into. And many times that these backcountry people will turn on the colonists on the coast, who they see as elitists, very much like Bacon's Rebellion, to demonstrate that they're furious about how they're not being treated very well. How are the slaves treated in different parts of the colonies? Like they mentioned in your textbook, the deeper you go into the south, the more you're finding plantation slavery. In the north, you find people working more as low-wage workers, and essentially like house servants or apprentices or whatever. And then as you get into the deep south, you'll find like really scattered plantations that don't really have much neighboring farming going on. And those can be pretty lonely places for the plantation folk who are finding themselves stuck in the middle of nowhere with a plantation owner who can be pretty mean. Why were this 18th century colonies not socially equal? Economically, there's going to be differences between the colonies. Culturally, especially with religion, there'll be differences. So, like, the people in Massachusetts will look down on the people of Chesapeake for being Anglican and backwoodsy, and they're dropping dead early, and it seems like there's a lot of dirty riffraff going on down there. So you got different colonies looking down on each other, but then also some of the colonies are really taking off with population, either because of birth rates or because of immigration coming in. So places like Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, Virginia will become very much noted as higher cultural colonies because of the wealth they're bringing in and the immigration that they're having moving into their area. How would I explain the class system in colonial society? Upper class can be determined, like Massachusetts, by religious elitism. But the thing you should notice is if you lived in Massachusetts, people there would believe that God would bless you by making you financially, economically successful. And so there's a feeling that the people who are the best and the brightest are also the ones who are doing the best because God is blessing them. And so we see that as a determinant in a lot of the colonies, that if you are wealthy, that can help you become upper class, and that can create a social class for you, even though many of these people started off from the same origins back when they started in the 1600s. How are taverns? How are they important to the development of colonial culture? This is your meeting places. And so for us, we're going to find with the revolution, that's going to be where they're meeting to discuss issues that they're having inside colonial society. What exactly was the purpose of the Great Awakening? Did it serve its purpose or do the opposite? I think we got to that entire question just a little bit ago. And so feel free to post if you still got a question about that religious movement. For the people who are out there like Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield, they had the ambition of holding on to their old-style puritanical religion, but their speaking fired people up, and then a bunch of other people were listening, and they were getting the idea that they could then become their own saviors as far as being able to work their way into God's good graces. And so what those guys were trying to do, they did accomplish firing people up, but then they also split their church because they had a huge group of people who were fired up but wanted to go a totally different direction than the Puritans who were listening to Whitefield and Edwards. Who is Patrick Henry and John Singleton Copley? These two individuals are going to be big in U.S. history. Copley is going to be a painter, and he is going to be important because of his portraiture that he is creating. Patrick Henry, he is going to be famous as an American patriot who is going to be noted throughout history because of his patriotic writing that he had and speeches that he's delivering during the Revolution itself. What was the schooling situation in a different part of the colonies? In the North, you had a lot of public education, the building of colleges, and that was something that spread somewhat through the middle colonies, but especially when you moved to the Chesapeake, since you didn't have big cities, you typically didn't have big schoolhouses for a lot of kids. The rich people didn't want their kids going to school with poor people, and the poor people really couldn't afford to have their kids go to school when all they were going to ever be is tenant farmers anyways. And so they would start working at a very young age to try to help supplement their family's income. If you were somebody who was rich, you would typically then hire a tutor or send your kids off to boarding school or something like that so that they can get their education, because that would be seen as an elite sort of thing to do to keep those kids moving up culturally. I think we already got to the Zenger trial, so hopefully we're good with that. Next question, is it important to note which colonies were royal, which were proprietary, and which were self-governing? The biggest thing to be picking up on is notice that you have proprietary colonies, and what a proprietary colony means is it's a money-making colony owned by one or multiple individuals. So think about like the Virginia Company. That would be a proprietary company that was part of a joint stock company. What we want you to notice, though, is that for many of these colonies, the king is going to get so fed up with the failure of these companies, that he will, in a lot of times, take away the ownership from the proprietorship and then make them into a royal colony. We want you to notice that trend taking place as the king is finding that this isn't working out for mercantilism, because a lot of that money is staying with the colonists. And if it doesn't, it's going back to the company, and the king instead would like to get the money for himself to make mercantilism work. for self-governing, a lot of these colonies are self-governing. So they mentioned to you that even though they're either a proprietorship or a royal colony, they mentioned that every colony by the 1700s has its own two-house legislatures, one with a house that's being chosen by the king and then a house that's being elected in. And the colonists love that a lot. It's very much like the House of Burgesses, and it's a form of self-government within the structure of being governed by the king, but that's during a period of salutary neglect where the king's handling is very, very mild and it's not having a huge influence. Does Lord Cornbury have any impact on the colonies? He is involved in New York and New Jersey. He is not an essential person to know from your textbook. He is connected with William and Mary, and he's one of their allies during the Glorious Revolution. But I would not spend a lot of time focusing on Lord Cornbury. What were the most important restrictions on voting? If you were a white male, you had a shot at voting, but depending on which colony you were in, like in the Chesapeake, they put together land provisions, and that becomes popular throughout the New World, where in the 13 colonies, they definitely will try to keep non-property holders from voting because they're seen as dangerous riffraff who don't have much going for them. And so there's a feeling that the people who should be voting should be people who are elite, but it's not elite like monarchy and titled. It's just through society's definition of what elite means. And in their case, it means owning land and actually doing something profitable with it. Let me see here. What is the big picture to take away from these chapters? We nailed that already. Who were the Huguenots? And for the Huguenots, we've already discussed that they were Calvinists in France who are clashing with the Catholics, who they don't like, until the Edict of Nantes, which is going to put down that religious intoleration. They'll start getting along with each other. After George Washington and his men were captured by the French, did the French kill them or release them? They did a little both. They killed some of the American soldiers, and then they released the rest. And George Washington then returned back to the battlefield afterwards to play a prominent role in leading militia into the French and Indian War. Were Jesuits basically French conquistadors? I can understand why you'd say that. They are instead very much like the Spanish missionaries, like De las Casas, who's going along with the conquistadors for the encomienda system, where they're trying to be the religious people who are converting people over to God in the French colonies, going along with the voyageurs instead. I would say the voyageurs would be closer to the conquistadors, but that's a really dangerous thing to do because they're not establishing encomiendas or that sort of stuff. They're instead traveling to where the Indians are, trying to create good relationships with them and trade with them. So I understand what you're trying to do with that, but having the basis as being what's the equivalent of a conquistador in the other colonies is a really rough place to be that I don't think is going to work out well. What is the point of giving back a city with a strategic geographic advantage to your enemy? For the British, their idea was that they really didn't care about the St. Lawrence River all that much because when they looked at the French colonies, they were pretty small anyways. They're little fur trading colonies, and so the British weren't all that concerned about it during that war. Remember, it's years before the French and Indian War, though, and so for the king, things changed, and they're going to become much more interested in the French when they get to the French and Indian conflict. But also remember that the king is very much worried more about what's happening in Europe, so if he can get a good deal in the European sphere, he really doesn't care about North America all that much as long as they're making cash for him. And so that's the reason why they're willing to make that trade, even though it seems kind of silly nowadays. Why was France developed or colonized late? I think that's an oversimplification. So the point they were making was they jumped in the colonization game late after the Spanish. So the Spanish got started first. French and British started a little bit later, and by that point, the Spanish had already established encomiendas through much of the southern parts of the Americas. And so for the French, they're going to set up colonies in the West Indies and other places like Haiti, but they're going to find that a lot of places are taken by the Spanish already by the time they start looking around. Are the War of Jenkins' Ear and King George's War the same? Yep, the first merges into the second. And that becomes the major conflict before we have our French and Indian War. What cities did the British keep rather than giving them back? After the French and Indian War, the French kept all of them. The British kept all of them. And so the French lost out on all of their American colonies. There's other deals in other parts of the world that are really not consequential to us because they're outside of U.S. history. Although when you take world history next year, you stand a better chance of running into them and making sense out of them. And then you'll be able to place them into the context of what we've studied so far. What is the significance of Fort Duquesne? Fort Duquesne is that fort that's on the Ohio River that is in modern-day Pittsburgh, where multiple rivers meet together. And so if you want to travel up the Ohio or down the Ohio River, you're doing it in the face of this gigantic fortress that could blow you up if you're trying to do river traffic. So as long as the French have a series of forts along the Ohio, and especially in Fort Duquesne, there are no British people who are going to be able to move stuff downriver without having their ship blown up as they try to move stuff. And so that's why it's so significant. Will we treat the French and Indian War and the 7 Years' War exactly the same? Absolutely. For our class, the two of them are indistinguishable. When you move on to world history next year, just do the equations so that when you're learning about stuff that's happening in the European sphere, you're able to then tie it together with the stuff that you learned here in the United States history. Can I explain why the question intercolonial disunity that prevailed during the French and Indian War was caused by all except... And it says the answer was differences about the continuation of slavery. So it's asking you about intercolonial disunity. And it's asking why the colonists weren't similar to one another, why there was disunity rather than unity. So they give you a bunch of options underneath that question that show you legitimate reasons why the colonies aren't united with one another. The one that they give you, though, there were no differences at that time about the continuation of slavery. All of them were okay with slavery continuing. That's only going to be ended in the late 1700s, where when we get to the Declaration of Independence, there's a bunch of northern states that find it really weird that they're fighting for independence while they're also fighting for the right to keep people as slaves. It's very easy, though, for Northerners to take that position because they've got diverse economies that are going to make it very easy to give up on slavery. And the way they're using their slaves anyways is like as house servants or as like apprentices. So they will just set them free, but essentially treat them as second-class citizens, and they will also limit how far they can move up in society. So essentially they're still on the same level as being slaves, but they're not technically slaves. In the South, though, you've got a system that's built up where the plantation owners really liked having a lot of free labor because it makes their tobacco or rice or indigo cheaper than everybody else's in the world. And that's your key for our slavery. It's not that American tobacco is better or rice or indigo or eventually cotton. It's just that everybody else in the world actually has to pay their laborers to do the work that they're doing, and that will make the price of their products higher. If Americans can just get their work for free, they can charge less for their products, which means everybody will buy American stuff, which gives America an advantage. And so in the Deep South, you don't have people in the Chesapeake, Carolinas, who are mulling the idea of getting rid of slavery around the time of the Revolution, except for like the Founding Fathers who will do that. So that difference is coming, but it's not there yet, and that's the reason why it's the wrong answer. The colonists are pretty united that slavery is okay when we're in the chapters that we're studying. At what point in time did the natives attempt an attack on the colonists? Where did they attack and why did they attack? It's too many to count. That's the reason why you've got the Paxton Boys and the Regulators, and they're in warfare with each other. Sometimes the Native Americans will attack settlers who are moving into their area, or vice versa, and it's happening too often for us to pinpoint every single one of those. The best example you have from Chapter 6, though, is the Pontiac Rebellion, where you have a unified force of Native Americans who are trying to figure out ways to resist the movement of Europeans in the Ohio River Valley, and they're getting encouragement from the French trappers who are still in the area, even though the French lost. Almost everybody living in the French colonies, now British colonies, are still French. And so you do have multiple times where the Native Americans are being hostile to the Europeans, and most of them are not written in your textbook because there'd be too many to number. But it's a tension that's happening as everybody's moving into the same spot in a middle ground. Let me see here. Rather, why did they feel emboldened enough to attack? For the Native Americans, their biggest issue is if they don't, they're just going to get pushed off their land. So, like, there's a trickiness to your question where, like, you're asking, when did the Native Americans attack these guys? And part of it is after many of them have already been shoved back repeatedly and destroyed by epidemics, and they're finding that there's Europeans encroaching in their land. And so for these guys, they're finding that there's moments where if they don't fight, they're going to lose everything. And in the middle ground, if they are allied with the French will sometimes be egging them on too, with the offer of supplies and resources and a carved out place to live. So it's complicated. The Europeans and the Native Americans are interacting, and that's oftentimes driving a lot of the conflicts of the time. What are the main religions we need to take away from 5 and 6? That's a tricky question, and so let me put it as plainly as I can. You learn about in the Spanish colonies they had Catholicism. The French have the same through the Great Lakes and the Mississippi River. Along the English colonies, they're almost all Protestants. Even though they try to create a Catholic haven in Maryland, it's almost all Protestants who are either Anglican, like they're in the Chesapeake in the South, or else you have some Quakers in Pennsylvania, or else you have the Puritans and the Pilgrims up north. And so you're about to have a bunch of religious wars and political wars in Europe that bleed over to the Americas, and there's already a hatred between the Protestant English and the Catholic French and Spanish that's causing tensions, and then there's all sorts of tension with the Native Americans as well. So we really don't need you to drive down deep into like all the different religious groups, but we do want you to understand that there's a diversity there that's preventing union from happening, because it's one more thing that drives a wedge between the different colony groups. Let me see here. We already covered what the Cajuns were. These are Acadians who get driven off to New Orleans when the British don't want to keep them in the area just north of Maine. We already discussed what was going on with the Albany plan, so if you've still got problems with that, feel free to post at the end and I'll be able to work that out. Did General Braddock do, and what were the effects of it? Remember, he's the guy who marched in the Ohio River Valley to start the French and Indian War, and he got slaughtered as he went through there with George Washington. So it was his defeat that really hurt him a ton. What were the major achievements of William Pitt? Remember, he's the guy who was the prime minister who was able to focus the French and Indian War exclusively on the Americas to try to bring an end to the French threat there, unlike the previous kings and queens had done. And then they had the Battle of Quebec, which is William Pitt wanting to take out the capital city of New France. It says, what's the significance of the Treaty of Paris? It's the one that ends the French and Indian War and removes the French as a colonial force in North America. Why was the French and Indian War a global war? Remember, that's because you've got England versus France and other countries and also their allied colonies in mercantilism, and so they'll all be part of the war effort scattered throughout all the different parts of the world. Were there any reparations given to the colonies for their sacrifices during the French and Indian War? The colonists were expected to pay up because the British, in their mind, thought that they had done a service for the Americans by freeing them from the threat of French attacks in their colonies. And so the idea of giving the British subjects in the 13 colonies more stuff isn't in the thought process. Instead, the feeling is that they should be grateful and willing to pay taxes and obey the laws that the king has created. And the king is also really unhappy about the fact that with salutary neglect, these were some pretty unruly soldiers during the war who were fighting, but they were also asking way more questions, and they were very much less enthusiastic than he wanted them to be, and so that caused tensions. What was Pontiac's uprising? We just mentioned that a second ago. And what did the Proclamation Line of 1763 set? Remember, the Proclamation Line of 1763 is the line along the Appalachian Mountains that was created at the end of the French and Indian War that told colonists they can't move west into the Ohio River Valley. It was created because the king said that Pontiac, who was a Native American leader, had built an alliance through the Midwest that was attacking colonists along the frontier at the urging of the French, who were feeding them information that they wanted to have them attack the British to keep them out of their land. For the colonists, remember, though, they're not interested in having the Proclamation Line of 1763. They would prefer to wipe out the Native Americans and take over their land. And so it's going to cause tension between the king and the colonists because of that decision. Is it important to note that the defiance of the Proclamation of 1763 was essentially the start of the Manifest Destiny mindset? I would not go there. And I know where you're going, and I don't have any problem with you making that association, because it's not gonna hurt a thing. Because essentially the point that's being made with that question is that during the period of manifest destiny, there's going to be a feeling that Americans have that they are God's people who should spread American culture from East Coast to West Coast. And so it's similar with what you see happening here, but it's kind of a tricky simplification where if you wanted to take it to its extreme, I mean, essentially the violation of the Proclamation of 1763, how is that different than any other expansion west during the early time periods from the colonies that are established into Native American territory to take it over for American settlement? And so the issue is less, is it similar? Sure it is. But where did it start? I don't know that the French and Indian War is the first time the colonists got the idea of displacing Native Americans and moving out west, because you've seen it from 1607 all the way forwards. And you see other Europeans behaving in quite the same way. With Manifest Destiny, though, it's going to be the idea that it's American values that are being spread out, and that's what's going to make it distinctive as they move from East Coast to West Coast. Is it more important to note that the defiance of the proclamation was another blatant disregard of British law in the colonies? That's absolutely dead on, because the king is eventually going to get fed up with how independent the colonists are, and that's going to bring an end to salutary neglect because he doesn't like what's going on with that. Can you explain the Great Awakening and its effect afterwards, including the old and new lights? So hopefully we got that already. Remember, that's Jonathan Edwards, George Whitefield trying to stir up religious passion in Puritans, but eventually it ends up splitting the church between old lights who want the old style of religion and the new lights who believe that they can work their way into heaven, and they want a much more open version of religion that is much more forgiving than the one that was already established. Presbyterians are people who are coming from Scotland who also believe in John Calvin. So you don't just have Puritans and Pilgrims who are Calvinists. You also have the Presbyterians. You also have the Huguenots that are also Calvinists. So you got a lot of people coming over here with pretty strict religious interpretations of predestination and how religion works, all influenced by the same guy. We already got to William Pitt and the proclamation line. Some social differences between the colonial society in the 1600s and 1700s. Essentially what I would do with the social differences, early in the 1600s you had a very rustic society where they're very much colonial. As we move forward, you're going to find that each colony is going to start developing its own distinctive cultural ways, whether it's New England with their towns, or else the Chesapeake with their plantations along the rivers, or the scattered backcountry plantations in the Chesapeake. And then as you move into the 1700s, we're over a century removed from Jamestown, and these colonies have a very much American feel. And instead of being like a mile or two into the coastline, you're talking about miles along the eastern seaboard that are filled with farms. And then they're pushing the Native Americans further and further into the backcountry, creating their own distinctive places of either tobacco plantations or rice and indigo plantations, or all the other economic ideas that we have had previously. What were clergy or clerics? That's all just religious people. So if you ever hear about a cleric, that is a priest or some sort of religious person who's working in the church, and the clergy is the same. What's the difference between King William's War and Queen Anne's Wars? They came at two different times, but again, they're both wars that start off over in Europe and then bleed over to the Americas, and they're very much judged when they're finished up by what the European countries can get from each other rather than what they've accomplished here in the New World. We've already covered George Whitefield and Jonathan Edwards, so we should be good. Why was the Albany Congress not a success? Remember, with the Albany Congress during the French and Indian War, Franklin wanted to create a unified group, kind of like the New England Confederation, to defend the colonies against Native American attack. But his issue was that the colonists didn't want to give up their freedoms and create a central government, and that King felt like he'd be giving up too much power for the colonies to be able to govern themselves independently, and so it's going to throw them into a problem trying to get that done. What is proprietary? Anytime you hear about a proprietorship, it's a business owned by individuals. So it's not going to be like owned by a corporation. It's not going to be owned by a whole like the government. Instead, like if you have a local pizza place that's owned by a guy, who owns it himself. He is the sole proprietor of that pizza place. So we learned some colonies are businesses that are owned by a certain group of people. That would be a proprietorship. If it's owned by the king, it's a royal colony, and that's where those two terms are coming from. Who are the Huguenots? To remind you, those are the Calvinists from France who are not loved by the Catholics, and they face a lot of religious intolerance. Let me see here. Is John Trumbull and other artists important to know? I would not spend a ton of time worrying about John Trumbull, largely because he and others are interested in creating portraits during this time period. So knowing about portraiture is a good thing to know, although it's not a massive test item. But instead, understanding that that's their main art form, because if you hire an artist, they're going to be the ones who record for you images of your family members, and it'll be probably the only chance you get to actually have a lasting image of what your family looks like. That's a privilege that's reserved for the upper classes. Although we will start to democratize that sort of opportunity here in the United States when we start turning to photography in the mid-1800s, and we're going to see a transition from the portraiture of Trumbull into the art forms that we see coming later. Will we need to know the orders of the wars? I mean, in a minor sense, you should know them, but I'm not going to spend like 20 questions on them. But yeah, you should definitely know that which wars came first, and then be able to work your way through the French and Indian War to explain the transition from European wars first to William Pitt's decision to really focus in on the French and Indian War. Did colonists who broke the proclamation of 1763 get punished? They could be. If they were captured, they could get returned back to their home territory, losing their right to squat in the area. They could face other punishments from the soldiers. But there is also such a wave of people moving into this area that the king lacked the resources or really the interest to stop it. And so eventually, when we get to the 1760s and 1770s, a lot of the soldiers get moved from the frontier along the proclamation line to instead the cities themselves, because they're there to kind of watch the colonists, because they're becoming more and more unruly. And so he's a little concerned about how radical the colonists are becoming. Are we going to do any matching on the tests? TMRW tomorrow. I haven't put any of those types of questions on the test yet, so I'm not certain, but I don't anticipate it'll be a big portion of the test. What was the difference between the Paxton Boys and the Regulator movement? The Paxton Boys came first up in Pennsylvania, and then they influenced the Regulator movement to the south with the same sort of feelings and viewpoints about the elites on the East Coast. Will we need to know the timeline for the events in Chapter 5 on this test? I'm not sure what you mean by that. If you're talking about like the entire timeline at the end of the chapter, there's definitely significant events that are on that timeline. As far as me giving you a gigantic timeline and having you place 20 events, that's not typically the way that our tests work. Why were not all the colonies included in the Join or Die cartoon? That's a really good question. I'm not sure why. It's one of the things I've wondered about as well. How did Edward Braddock die? He was ambushed by the French and their Indian allies as they moved through the backcountry of the Ohio River Valley to start the French and Indian War. Let me see. Did the Anglo-Saxons have any impact on the 13 colonies? The Anglo-Saxons are a term to describe English people and Northern Europeans who are coming from the blending of the Angles and the Saxons from the Middle Ages. So essentially, those groups dominated Northern Europe, and when they say Anglo-Saxons, they're describing how ancestors of the Angles and the Saxons eventually became the people who lived in England and these other Northern European countries, and then they're the ones who eventually moved over to the New World like centuries later. So it's not about them being a group during this time period. Instead, it's their ancestors who see themselves as being higher up than everybody else because of their Anglo-Saxon background. Let me see here. What's the difference between the Coureurs de Bois and the Voyagers? They're both French explorers who are moving through the backcountry. And so they're going to be the ones who are working to try to trade with the Native Americans. I hear a message by Yo. It says, "I can't hear, bro." I'm assuming that I had a lot of other people who sent me a message saying that they could. So I got a "we're good." So hopefully we can work out how to get this sound going for the rest of you guys. But let me run through the last 2 questions and I'll see what I can do with the video. So let me post a message about that. So let me see the last things. What were the most influential slave revolts during the early 1700s? By far, the most important ones are the New York slave revolts and the Stono Rebellion. But remember, both of them are going to fail. And eventually they're going to lead to more repression with the slave codes. How did the Edict of Nantes affect Huguenots? We just covered that over the past hour. So remember, that's going to be Louis XIV, who is going to put into effect his edict, which essentially says that there's going to be limited religious toleration between Catholics and Protestants, so they're not killing each other. And in the Protestants are those Huguenots, the French Calvinists, that are going to be rolled into that group. Finally, what are the most dominant denominations during these time periods? We covered that about a half hour ago. Anglicans to the southern colonies. You had an attempt to create a Catholic haven in Maryland. You've got Puritans up in Massachusetts, Quakers in Pennsylvania, but largely the 13 colonies are Protestants, and then along the French and the Spanish colonies, they're largely Catholics who don't like Protestants. So that's going to be where your religious groups are located. And it's very much our idea that the wars between the French and the Spanish and the British are largely political wars, power wars, but also with a religious tinge to them between Catholics and Protestants. But then also within the colonies, there's tensions because of the religious differences too. How exactly do you limit toleration? Simply, I mean, if you take a look at inside of our country nowadays, you'll find that everybody has basic human rights, but there's also within our country still a lot of hostility towards certain religious groups, certain ethnicities, certain whatever, where all the king is offering is a basic protection against like severe persecution, but it's not like he's giving equal rights to all religious groups to be able to function fully inside of society, and they can still face a lot of barriers and problems, even though the law is going to be forbidding people from like burning one another at the stake or doing other things to torture one another or whatever. So I get where your question's coming from, but I think if you think about it a little bit, you can see that there's a large gray area for how you can go from not killing each other to full equality. Let me see here. Is the test tomorrow curved to 44 again? I plan on doing that with all the tests. Can you go into detail about King William's and Queen Anne's wars and why it occurred? I can, but that's not essential. And so for us, when we think about those wars, like I mentioned, the French and Indian War is key. For those 2 wars, the big thing we want to be able to dial into is they start off as British versus French conflicts that eventually bleed over into the Americas. And then after the war is done, the British and the French are much more interested in getting things from one another in the balance of power over in Europe, and America is seen as an afterthought in those wars. And so we really want to be able to contrast those to the French and Indian War, where William Pitt is going to shift the mentality to America first, where he wants to drive the French out, so he no longer needs to worry about them as being a threat to English colonization. When will occur? Let me see. What was the Intolerable Act? You're getting a couple chapters into the future. That's going to be after the Boston Tea Party, where the king is going to shut down Boston Harbor, not reopen until Boston can repay the debt from the tea being dumped into the harbor, and it's going to be the impetus for the war to start, where this is going to cause the Bostonians to become really angry, and the American Revolution will come soon afterwards. When will the curve for chapter 1 through 4 test go into the grade book? Soon. This past weekend has been pretty crazy. Friday night we had my kids going to their school's homecoming. Yesterday we were running around for athletic events, and I've been coaching softball from about 7 o'clock in the morning till I got home right before I went on the air with you guys. And now I'm broadcasting online to try to help you to get better test scores. So I totally get that you want to have that reflected in the gradebook, but it's been busy. So I definitely have that on my agenda to knock things out. And if that's an inconvenience, I totally understand that, but there's only so much I can do. So I'll try to get that done for you. Is there anything else that you guys have questions for? I've gone through as much questions as I see here, so I'll wait for just a little bit longer. The update, if you were curious, talk about a beautiful day for softball. It was like 90 degrees all day long. We didn't get any of the rain that came through this area, and we drove through just pounding rain. It's supposed to go from like 90 down to 70 overnight. My daughter played left field exclusively today, was banging the ball around the outfield pretty good. And their team was able to take third in Tier 3 in Rosemount. But unfortunately, they only had 9 players today. And so by the end, they were all gassed. And so they ran into a team, I think it was like Highland or something like that. And these girls could just hit the ball like crazy. And so unfortunately, our girls got derailed. My daughter was able to recover pretty easily, though, where I asked her if she was disappointed about not being in the finals. And her response was, it's hot out there. I'm okay riding home right now. So after we had some Rita's Italian Ice, it was all good, and we're doing great. So I don't see any of the questions popping up here. So I'm assuming you guys are good. That doesn't mean that you can't buzz by and ask me any last-minute questions if you guys need them. But good luck with your review tonight. Make sure you come to class with your notes done and ready to submit. And I hope everything goes well with your test tomorrow. Good luck, you guys. Have a good night.